Hi, thanks for joining me and for your interest in pursuing information about the most humane and effective ways to work with fearful dogs. This webinar was distilled from a full-day seminar that I offer. So there's lots more information out there, but this should give you a pretty good overview of how you should begin to start thinking about dogs who are afraid of things. First of all, patience. This implies being patient with the dog, patient with yourself, patient with the owners or caregivers who are struggling to live with these dogs. Our patience, or what we might call impulse control in dogs, can improve through practice. So even if you don't feel patient, practice being patient. This presentation is geared toward giving you not only an overview of how fear and anxiety impact a dog's behavior, but to also give you some ideas for sharing this information with people in ways that can help them understand it and facilitate their acceptance of these ideas. We need to get them to buy into what we're selling in the face of mountains of contradictory and inaccurate information regarding dog behavior and how animals learn. And I understand that I need to convince you to accept it, and I'm sure going to try. Now, my own efforts to help people understand the most effective and humane ways to work with fear-based behavior challenges in dogs is based not only on the science of how behavior works, but also on the fact that we're both social animals, and somewhere along the evolutionary trail, dogs threw their hat into the ring with us, and it's through our relationship with them that we can best impact their quality of life. And in doing so, we're not only going to make their lives better, I think that we can grow. We become more skilled and more compassionate in the process. It's important to know that in the United States, there are no regulations regarding who can call themselves a dog trainer or a behaviorist or a behaviorologist or whatever. The information that I'm sharing today is based on the science of applied behavior analysis, so if we're looking for more clarification or you have questions, that's what we can refer back to. Now, we humans are very proud of our big brains, and we can and we should use those brains to reflect on how what we feel when we're working with an animal can impact our own behavior. Now, we can guess how we're likely to respond if we feel fear, anger, or frustration. Unlike our dogs, however, we can talk ourselves through those emotions and think about it and choose the most effective response, not just the one that we feel like performing. And which is the first behavior we have to change when we're working with a fearful dog? It's not that much of a trick question. It is our own. It's likely that we find ourselves interacting with a variety of dogs, each with their own unique history, but there is often a common denominator. And when I talk about dogs in transition, I'm referring to many of the dogs that we find ourselves with. These are dogs newly placed in homes, in foster care, in shelters, or in rescues, or on a transport. And what they all have in common is stress. Now, stress results from interactions between organisms and their environment, and they can be perceived as straining or even exceeding their adaptive capacities and threatening their well-being. And of course, a certain degree of stress is a normal part of a living organism's response to the inevitable changes in its environment. However, excessive and prolonged demands on an organism's coping resources can have a negative impact on their health. Now, the signs that I've listed in the next few slides are based on studies that were done with people. But because mammals' limbic systems are similar, I don't think it's that inappropriate to consider how we might ascribe them to dogs. The much beleaguered lab rat has been used as a model for studying emotions and health in humans for decades, and turning the tables and using human models to understand emotion and behavior in dogs doesn't seem that much of an unreasonable stretch. Now, some of the signs listed may not apply to dogs because they may incorporate thought processes for which there is not yet evidence to support that they actually occur in dogs. Don't feel like you need to write them down or memorize them. I'm just presenting these signs as a way to shed light on things that might be going on with the dog that maybe we haven't considered. Consider the implications feeling nauseous or having chest pain or visual difficulties could have on a dog's behavior and their response to our attempts to train them. Think about how feeling confused or having trouble concentrating could impact a dog's ability to learn new skills. These represent the reasons why we need to practice patience. Now, we have no way to know exactly how a dog might describe how they're feeling emotionally, but again, given that emotional responses in dogs and in people are centered in the same parts of our brains and can impact other parts of our brains in similar ways, I don't think that it's over anthropomorphizing to consider that a dog can become depressed. There are measurable physiological changes that occur when an animal is what we would label as depressed, and chronic stress is associated with depression in people. And again, I think we could assume we might be seeing similar effects in our dogs. We're treading on more solid ground as trainers when we look at the behavioral signs of stress. And I suspect as you read through this list, you may be seeing things that you've noticed in dogs that you've lived with or worked with. Now, most of us, thankfully, have never experienced fear to the degree that some dogs are forced to cope with daily. I mean, seeing a dog lose control of their bowels or their bladder or anal glands should be an indication of just how scared they are. But many people dealing with it are often end up just being concerned about having to clean up after them, and they fail to identify the dog's abject terror. And an unwillingness or inability to eat is another common indication of fear and stress that we see in dogs. It's not just an annoyance to us, it could be a symptom of potentially damaging levels of stress. And although stress itself may not be the cause of health issues, it could contribute to a body's inability to cope with disease or contribute to the development of imbalances in a dog's system that could lead to disease. I think of our fearful, phobic, and anxious dogs as though they're living on the top of a cliff. We may never be able to fully extricate them from the top of that cliff, but we can help move them away from the edge. We can help them develop the resiliency and tolerance to cope with a life that's going to give them shoves in that direction. We move them further away from the edge so they don't go off. Now, I know some of us are dealing with dogs that are already in the abyss, and we need to pull them out, or maybe they're clinging precariously to the edge and we can't let them fall down. A couple of things to consider with behavior modification. The first is that it is our response and the consequences we apply to a dog's behavior that's going to impact how their behavior is maintained or changes. And because for people who are in daily contact with a dog, it's imperative that their responses are geared toward creating improvement. Now, if we experience fear, anger, or frustration when faced with a dog's behavior, we may be more likely to respond in ways that are less rather than more helpful. Now, we may not be able to change our immediate emotional response to a dog, but we can use our big brain to understand what might be driving the dog's behavior. And then we set them up so that we see less of behaviors we don't like and more of the ones that we do. This can also help us make better choices when we're managing and providing immediate feedback to dogs. I like to think of it as pet therapy, PET, play, exercise, and training. Get the dog to play, work for the wag. Dogs who don't feel safe are not likely to play. Help them feel safe. Exercise, training, and play often do, and probably should, look very similar to each other. Now, the other point is that while we can't ignore a dog's behavior, we need to constantly remind ourselves to look beyond it and ask, is this dog upset? Is this dog scared? And if we have reason to believe that they are, we focus on using counter-conditioning and desensitizing to change that. Remember Pavlov and the power of classical conditioning. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Pavlov and his experiments with salivating dogs, take a few minutes and do some reading online. It's easy to find information about it. Because what we learned is that if we can address the emotion that's driving a particular behavior and we can change that emotion, we'll often see a change in the behavior that it was contributing to. Watch this next video and see for yourself. Do you think that this kitten had any control over its behavior? Sure doesn't look like it. There are both physiological and evolutionary reasons why we will see behaviors like that. An animal's survival depends on how well they can avoid danger. A gazelle who ponders for an additional second or two whether or not that rustling in the grass is the same lion that tried unsuccessfully to eat them yesterday may be today's lunch. Brains that are faced with chronic exposure to things that startle or frighten them develop larger amygdalas, and that's the part of the brain that we generally consider is where a lot of the fear responses originate. And this can lead to or contribute to the pathological levels of vigilance, startling, and inhibition that we can see in dogs. Now, research on people using fMRIs showed that there was activity in the amygdala before the visual cortex. So the amygdala registered the trigger before other parts of the brain, specifically the part that would have identified it, was aware of it. And no doubt you've experienced this yourself when even as you're startling, you recognize that what has scared you is not a threat. Oh, and while you're in mid-leap, you know, oh, it's a stick, it's not a snake. Now, if we want a dog to be able to make good choices when faced with triggers, those are the objects or events that scare them, we need to provide them with a repertoire of well-rehearsed behaviors they can perform under pressure. And it's up to us to make sure that the pressure does not exceed their ability to be successful at performing the behaviors we want them to. We do not send novice firefighters into burning buildings with new pieces of equipment and expect them to learn how to use it. But we do this all the time to our dogs. We put them in situations in which they do not have the skills to be successful in, and then we get upset with them for not being able to do what we need them to do. To help these dogs, we often have to trace the dread that they're experiencing back to where it begins and address it. We become artists at shaping and splitting, not only for building new behaviors, but for desensitizing and counter-conditioning to the things they dread. So an example of this is, let's say you have a dog and they're afraid to go outside, but they begin to avoid or resist having a leash clipped on their collar. Now, if we want them to learn that going outside is a good thing, we have to start where the dread likely begins to build, and that's probably when they see the leash or there's some other cue that they're going to be taken outside. Now in this next video, I'm filming through a grate and a door. There's no sound and it's kind of shaky footage. I apologize. But the situation is that this dog was part of a large breeder confiscation, and this dog was housed with other dogs. And when you went in to the stall to clean or feed, the dogs would come charging and barking and lunging, and this little fella, Scrappy, was particularly aggressive. Now, it would also turn out that he would go after the other dogs that were in the kennel with him, in the stable with him. And so those dogs were taken away. And when those dogs were taken away, this is the behavior that we started to see. Now, if you had never seen this dog on his own and you'd only seen the way he behaved with other dogs, you would have just labeled him an aggressive, maybe even nasty little dog. But Scrappy was terrified. And when people talk about dogs shutting down, this is an example of what I think it looks like. And you'll see it in a minute. And the problem with this is that if we want to use positive reinforcement to train dogs, we can't train a dog who's shut down or turned off, because we need them to offer behavior that we can reinforce. When working with fearful dogs, I think we need to consider how the different aspects of their life will impact their quality of life and how we can create plans to address their needs in order to achieve the best for them. And these are the pieces to the puzzle that I think we need to address. We manage their environment so they feel safe. We address medical concerns and provide the best food and shelter we can. We desensitize and counter-condition to triggers, and we give them skills using positive reinforcement. This is from a book, Joseph Ledoux's The Emotional Life, and it's well worth having a look at if you're interested in how emotions impact behavior. You may be familiar with these puzzles. They're among the first puzzles that we give to toddlers, and you can watch how children mature by their attempts to solve the challenge of fitting the right block into the right hole. Initially, they'll pick up any block and they try to fit it into any hole. Then they'll start to make minor adjustments in the way they hold it until eventually they grow up enough and they can assess each piece individually and compare it with the available holes, and they have the dexterity to put it in. Now imagine for a moment what would happen if at any point along this progression of skills development, we were to punish them for not being successful, for doing it wrong. If the punishment is aversive enough, it's likely to inhibit their willingness to continue to engage with the puzzle, and their efforts to problem solve will cease. Now, it is of the utmost importance that we do not inhibit our dogs from being willing and able to continue experimenting with behavior. It is through this experimentation with behavior that we are provided with opportunities to reinforce behaviors we want to see more of and manage their environment so we see less of the ones we don't. Now, for whatever cultural or biological reasons, we seem to be more willing to prepare and use tools to address the possibility that rules will be broken. And we're less willing to prepare and use tools to address the inevitability of success. We need to learn how to do this. There are different ways that we can give our dogs opportunities to problem solve and behave in novel ways, and no doubt it's a topic for a webinar all on its own. One easy way is to get rid of food bowls, replace them with food toys. These dogs' brains have gotten really good at feeling bad, and we need to give them plenty of opportunities to feel good. In the lottery of life, these dogs have been losers, and we need to find ways for them to start winning. Give them the chance to experience the thrill of getting that last piece of chicken out of a Kong, or finding the squeaky toy hidden under a towel, or even considering where do the wild things go on Animal Planet. I'm going to talk about the following ideas because many of them are misunderstood or actually incorrect. Do you reinforce fear by comforting or rewarding a dog who's afraid? Short answer, no. Not all behavior is created equally. There are differences between how operant behaviors and respondent behaviors change when they are associated with something a dog finds pleasant or aversive. When we see behaviors that are elicited by fear, think of things like growling, cowering, hiding, and we are able to create good associations with something, we'll typically see a decrease in the intensity of the fear and similarly a decrease in the behavior that's been elicited by that fear. This is in contrast to an operant behavior which, when performed, produces a positive outcome. In this case, we're more likely to see an increase in behavior, like the dog sits down and gets cheese. We're likely to see more sitting. And certainly nobody would argue that a doctor giving a child a sheet of stickers or a lollipop is actually encouraging and reinforcing their fear of being in a clinic. Now, we are a questioning species. We can't help wondering about stuff. It's not unusual that people would wonder why their dog behaves the way they do. And it's not that having information about our dog's past isn't helpful. If we have it, it can help us moderate our expectations for a dog, but it's not information we need in order to help them. We do not have a microscope or a crystal ball to know anything concrete about most of the dogs we're likely to work with. And regardless of why a dog is afraid, we use the very same guidelines and techniques for working with them. We keep them feeling safe. We counter-condition and desensitize to triggering events or objects, and we give them skills using positive reinforcement. Oh, it would be great if all it took to change a fearful dog into a confident one was an herb, a medication, a massage technique, or learning how to be a better leader. But the reality is, and we need to accept it, there are no magic bullets. We know what we need to do, and we need to get very good at doing it. Keep them feeling safe. Give them skills. It's going to take as long as it takes. What we bring to the table, along with what the dog brings to the table, will affect how long it takes a fearful dog to become a happy pet dog. Our behavior goals may change along the way for a dog. So instead of becoming a therapy dog, well, maybe they become a happy pet whose world is smaller than we had originally planned. But the better we are at what we do, the easier it will be for the dog to learn. But consider yourself on Shy Dog Time. This idea that dogs live in the moment is out there. I call it the 51st Dates hypothesis. And if you're not familiar with the Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore film of the same name, it's about a woman who every day she wakes up having forgotten everything from the day before. And that's what I'm referring to. And maybe the condition exists, but the idea that dogs are suffering from brain damage or are some kind of Zen masters living entirely in the moment without their past having any impact on their current behavior is ludicrous. We don't have to teach our dogs their name every day or what it means when they hear kibble going into their bowl. Fortunately, we don't really have to worry about whether or not dogs want to dominate us. They are among some of the most successful species on the planet. Think about it. Did they get there by being dominant? No, they got there because they are able to cooperate with us and to avoid conflict. People often assume that if they expose their dog to a trigger and nothing bad happens, that it's enough to change the dog's mind about it. This may be true in some situations. The dreaded trash can on the corner ceases to frighten a dog once they've had the opportunity to investigate it, and barring it toppling over on their head, it's no longer a concern to them. But in the case of extreme fear, the proof that the trigger is a threat is the fact that the dog experiences fear. I'm going to say that again. As far as the dog is concerned, the proof that the trigger is a threat to them is the fact that they feel fear. And this may not be mitigated or eliminated by the fact that no actual harm comes to them. The harm has already occurred in the form of the immediate fearful response, and our best shot at changing this is through counter-conditioning and desensitization, not through forcing them to be exposed to it. There's an idea out there that there are two categories of dogs, those that are food motivated and those that are not, and this is not true. All dogs are motivated by food. All animals are motivated by food. If they're not, they're dead. But if we do have a dog and they do not seem to be motivated by the food that we're providing them, then we need to consider, are they sick? Are they scared? Are they full? Are they motivated by something else? Might they prefer a different food? When people say that all dogs learn differently, they're typically making excuses for using aversive methods to train, as though there are dogs on the planet who, for some unaccountable reason, cannot learn through positive reinforcement, and we know this is not the case. Dogs may be more or less motivated by things. They may have disabilities that impact the ability or speed at which they can learn new skills. They may have more or less sensitivity to visual, auditory, or kinesthetic input, but this does not mean that they learn differently than any other organism on the planet. Flooding is sometimes called exposure therapy. For people, I call it the suck it up and deal approach when we do it to our dogs. It's inappropriate for most of our fearful and phobic dogs for a couple of reasons. One is that they can become more sensitized to things, which means that it requires less of it to scare them, or we start to see an increase in their reaction to it. Contextual or higher order conditioning occurs when other objects, sounds, smells, anything in the environment when a dog is afraid becomes associated with that feeling of fear. That means that in the future, those things, in addition to the original trigger, can cause a fearful response, and that can include us. Now, dogs do not have control over these responses. The freeze up is often misidentified as an acceptance or tolerance of the trigger. Oh, look, he let me pet him. Stress hormones could linger in a dog's system for hours and could impact subsequent responses to triggers in the environment, which things that in the past maybe didn't cause a response, but now they do. Pain suppression can lead people to believe that things like prong collars, choke collars, or shock collars don't actually hurt because they don't see a predictable response to the pain that they produce. And there's an evolutionary reason for this as well. If you are running away from something that if it catches you is going to kill you and eat you, you don't worry about the fact that you've just stubbed your toe. And reflex potentiation means that if they end up biting, it can be fast. Bites that seem to come out of nowhere might be attributed to a dog who is frozen before biting. Keep your eye on this in this next video. Watch what the animal bites and watch and observe that open mouth behavior. that open mouth behavior that you saw in that animal, to me, not knowing a lot about it, looked like the animal was basically telegraphing and giving some information about what might happen next. It looked to me to be what we might call in dogs part of a ritualized aggression display. We see these in our dogs as well. Basically, before an animal gets into a fight, because fighting is a potentially expensive or risky behavior to get involved in. Because remember, if you happen to be an animal out in the wild and you get injured, that may be the end of you. So instead, we see some animals will have these displays, which are really the goal is to avoid a conflict rather than have one. Now, these responses to fear, they're not necessarily listed in a particular order, and a dog may or may not display one or the other, or may display some or all of them, depending on the quality of fear they're experiencing and their assessment of possible outcomes. Maybe if they think that they're going to be able to get away, they will. Freezing, they may try to run away. Freezing can impact a predator's response, and sometimes we'll see a sudden burst of behavior associated with freezing. Again, that fighting is an expensive response, and so we may see aggressive displays first, like that wide mouth behavior that you saw in the chameleon. Now, because dogs are social animals, I've added in submissive or appeasement behaviors, and I think of those as basically pleading for their lives. One of my pet peeves is that dog shaming meme where dogs are looking guilty. That's what I mean by an appeasement behaviors. The dog is basically saying with that look, not that I'm guilty, but look, I'm not a threat to you. Please don't be a threat to me. Robert Sapolsky is a professor at Stanford, and he's got a lot of good information out there on stress in primates. What he has discovered from studying brains is that both fearful and aggressive responses light up the amygdala, or do whatever they do when you're looking at brains, whether they're studying blood flows or electrical impulses, when they study them. This means that information can be shared quickly in the event that being fearful and freezing should be replaced quickly by aggression if it's more likely to save your life. And what this tells us is that if we look at dogs as a species, we know that fear-based behavior, fear-based responses are a normal part of their behavioral repertoire. And if we look at individual dogs, we can see that what might appear to be pathological responses may be normal given that dog's history. We should not be surprised when we see dogs displaying them. If someone has one leg in a cast, it doesn't make any sense to say that they run funny or wrong. They run the way we would expect someone with a leg in a cast to run. And aggression is a predictable response from a fearful dog. Injury, illness, system imbalances, we want to consider any of these, how they might be contributing to our dog's behavior. Now, although it's possible to create dogs who are genetically fearful, for my purpose, it doesn't make any sense to label them as such. I have no way to know for sure. And to do so could be used as an excuse for poor technique and not being successful at helping a dog. Now, it may be a pie-in-the-sky dream, but if more breeders and rescue groups were able to address fear-based behaviors in a more productive way early enough, we may be able to prevent the switching on of genes in dogs who are more predisposed to becoming fearful. And it would be good if breeders didn't continue to breed dogs who showed a lot of fear-based behaviors. But hands down, the most probable cause of fear-based behaviors that we see in many of the dogs that we work with is due to the lack of appropriate socialization as pups. And of course, dogs can learn to be afraid of anything at any point in their life that has scared or threatened them. Now, as trainers, whether you're a professional trainer or not, we need to know our species and the individual we're working with. Now, when I hear anyone use any of these terms to describe a dog, I suspect that we're talking about an untrained dog or a scared one, or both. Now, some terms are not only inaccurate, but they can negatively impact our perception of scared dogs, which leads to inappropriate responses on our part. So, the main reason these words warrant thinking about, as far as I'm concerned, is because they can mean something different to different people. So, claiming to be your dog's pack leader may not be a big deal if your definition of a leader is Mahatma Gandhi and not Idi Amin. Now, if someone subscribes to the Cesar Millan version of pack leadership, we need to understand dogs do not form packs the same way that wolves do. They do not have pack leaders. And if they don't have pack leaders, how are they supposed to understand what we're doing when we pretend to be a pack leader? Oh, it just doesn't make any sense. Now, the idea of coddling or comforting a dog as being a wrong thing to do, again, it bothers me because of, like the term leader, it can mean something different to whoever hears it. Basically, I don't know what the word looks like in action. If your coddling serves to comfort a dog where you actually see the dog's behavior improve, do it. Anything we can do to lower the stress a dog is experiencing it's going to be helpful in the long run. And the opposite of coddling for some people is going to be making the dog suck it up and deal, or flooding the dog, and we want to avoid that. Now, if somebody says that they comforted a dog and it didn't help, well, maybe they thought they were comforting the dog, but they actually weren't doing anything that was comforting at all. And another thing is that it is possible to be so scared that it's not going to matter how much you comfort them. I mean, look, comfort me all you want as you kick me out of a plane. I'm still likely to pee my pants on the way down. And when we talk about doing something because it works, we need to be sure that we're clear on exactly who a particular technique is working for, us or them. And people who are not really familiar with dog behavior and learning may not be clear on what they're actually seeing. And a shut-down dog who stopped offering behaviors because they've given up trying just might look calm, submissive to them. And then this would lead them to believe that an inappropriate training method was actually successful. We do not have to do things simply because it works for us. We can do things that are both ethical and are less risky as well. And the idea when we talk about training, again, training does not look the same for everyone. I had an experience where someone contacted me. They were looking to rehome their dog who was starting to bite them. Now, the dog wasn't biting them, but it had started to bite them, and I told them I didn't know anybody who wanted to adopt a dog who was biting its owners, but I would happily help them with training. And they informed me that they had tried training, and it didn't work. In fact, training had taken their dog who wasn't biting and created a dog who was. We need to be really clear on what we mean by when we talk about what training looks like. In some cases, it's going to be obvious and easy to identify a dog's triggers or the things that they're afraid of, and there may be more than one. And this is just the way that I break it down into social pressure, which may come from us or other animals, or they may be afraid of novel objects or sudden changes in their environment, or some of them are afraid of both. You'll hear these terms thrown around a lot in the dog training world. Triggers are the objects or events that scare the dog. Now, thresholds are loosely defined in the dog training world, so it is worth getting a better idea of what someone means when they use them. My definition of the term is that it's the point at which the dog's autonomic nervous system kicks in so that they are unable to necessarily perform a trained behavior, but instead are just reacting based on the intensity of the fear that they're experiencing. And now these thresholds may change. They may change as they age. They may change in certain context. So we basically need to just respond to the dog that we're actually looking at, and we work with the dog that's in front of us. I like this quote from Charles Darwin because it's a reminder to me that even we act fearfully to things that have never actually harmed us. In this next video, you're going to watch Snooki, and I want you to just watch Snooky's reaction to the clicking of the metronome, and watch how his reaction increases, decreases, and changes. And I'm showing you this because to illustrate habituation, or just letting an animal get used to something. So as you might imagine, Snooky doesn't have a lot of control over that reaction. And when I talk about habituation, what I mean is when an animal just gets used to something. And it's worth watching that video over again and seeing how after a certain number of clicks, Snooky's response does decrease. But anytime there's a change in the metronome or Snooky's location or proximity to it, you see a resurgence of that, the recurrence of that behavior come back again, that startle behavior. Because the reason to consider this is because when an animal has been scared, really scared by something, generally they do not ever just get used to it. So we don't generally recommend just trying to get a dog used to something that really scared them. In this next video, which I'm only going to play a short piece of, and I'm really just including it so that you can see a setup for working with a dog who might be afraid of us, or maybe we might be a little bit afraid of what they might do to us. So we'll see this setup. Nibbles was another breeder dog rescued from a breeding situation, and he was also a flight risk, so I had to keep him contained. But you'll see how I set him up with a crate.
You ready?
So he could hide from me.
Ready, Nibs? Come out for a little taste? No? Don't want to come out? Okay, then this is what we're going to do. We're going to walk out of the room. Come on. Come on, everybody.
The purpose of this kind of targeting or training exercises are just to start the conversation with the dog. Help the dog learn to pay attention to you, maybe your hand movements or what you talk about, and that should they happen to respond the right way, they're going to get something good from it. And this is just a little bit of cheese. Nibbles really loved that gooey cheese that you can buy. And sometimes these kind of setups help us keep our hands off a dog, which makes them feel safer.
Ready? Good boy. Nibbles, sit. Good for you. You did good. Okay. Yes. Yes.
And also consider how this sort of exercise will impact how a dog feels about hands.
Yes. Good boy.
Okay. Okay. Probably the most important thing that we can do is to prevent the escalation or the creation of aggressive behavior. People will often live happily with a dog who runs and hides when someone comes over. But a dog who behaves aggressively is more likely to be euthanized or relinquished to a shelter or handed over to someone with limited skill in positive reinforcement training to effectively and humanely rehabilitate the dog. And so what we need to do is maintain the animal's feeling of safety and security. And when I talk about paying for movement, we can pay for movement that occurs both towards us and away from us. If a dog chooses to move away from me, I might pay for that behavior because if a dog is fearful, I know that that fear could lead to aggression and that aggression is more likely to occur the closer they are to me. So if they choose to move away from me, I can pay them for moving away from me. And in some cases, that will help keep not only prevent them from becoming aggressive, but sometimes it can also decrease their inclination to run away. So for example, if I'm sitting in a chair and I go to stand up, and when I stand up, the dog panics and runs across the room, and I throw them a piece of cheese, what they will learn, they might learn, or they can learn, and often do learn, is that the lady standing up just means that the dog gets cheese. And when they learn that, eventually they actually stop running away in a panic. It's kind of counter conditioning on the fly. And of course, we need to help them learn skills because that is going to be the most important thing that we do, that we can help these dogs learn to be successful in the world. We never want to use food to lure a dog closer to us, and we need to be really careful about letting dogs make choices about what they get close to themselves. Better off teach the dog what you want them to do when they see something. If we allow dogs to sort of wander around and make choices and think that we're doing something, that they're being empowered or whatever's going on, we need to be careful. I think of it as teaching a little kid how to light matches. It could be a useful skill to have, but we can't necessarily trust them with it. So with these fearful dogs, sometimes rather than letting them decide that they're going to go sniff somebody, teach them instead that when they see somebody, they can sit next to you or come back to you. It may be a safer behavior all around. And eventually, when they start to not be afraid of people, then we can consider or not whether we want them to go over and give them a sniff or take a treat from them. So we're talking about the emotion, and that's fear. And the way that we deal with it is we keep the dog feeling safe. We desensitize and counter-condition to triggers, and we teach appropriate behaviors using positive reinforcement. Okay, this is counter-conditioning 101, and it's a critical component of helping these dogs. So I think it's worth spending some time on your own to learn more about it. Basically, the scary thing or the trigger is the conditioned stimulus. In this case, it's the man with the wrench. Condition just means learned. And what we're doing is the conditioned stimulus we see when the dog is aware of it. There is a CER or a conditioned emotional response, and in this case it's fear, and that fear is demonstrated. We're assuming that the dog is feeling fearful because we're seeing aggression. If we pair the conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus so that the conditioned stimulus becomes a reliable predictor of the unconditioned stimulus, with enough repetition and consistency, the conditioned stimulus becomes a reliable predictor of the unconditioned stimulus, and we start to see the conditioned emotional response that the animal had to the unconditioned stimulus, which is food. Unconditioned just means that they don't need to learn to feel good about it. It's food, they feel good about it. And what we know from Pavlov's experiments, if we take away the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus will still end up producing that feel good. And this is really our ace in the hole when we are working with these dogs. And key to understanding classical conditioning is that the receipt of the food by the dog is not contingent on the dog's behavior, but only on their awareness of the trigger. So in this case, if we were going to say we are going to classically counter condition to the trigger, the scared dog, we would have to make sure that the dog got food after they were aware of the man, regardless of their behavior. Now, we don't want to see this aggressive display, so we would want to change up the situation. That's where desensitization and gradual exposure comes in. But if we want the dog to learn that that man is a reliable predictor of food, the food has to appear regardless of how the dog is reacting to it. Now, if we are unable to provide an environment in which a dog can feel safe and where they no longer need to continue to display the behaviors we'd like to see end, behaviors such as growling, cowering, hiding, or lunging, we need to do something to move them away from the edge of the cliff. And behavioral medications can help. They're not a cure, but they're not a cop-out either. They are a tool to consider in the rehabilitation and training of fearful dogs. And the risks of waiting to use them is not unlike the risk of waiting to use an antibiotic for an infection. If a body is unable to rally and fight the infection, by the time the meds are brought on board, it may be too late to save the limb or even the animal's life. Now, I am not a vet, and I am not saying you should put your dog on meds, but I am suggesting that you speak to a vet about them sooner rather than later. These dogs are suffering, and meds could provide them with relief, and not to consider them is inhumane, in my opinion. Now, many of the behavioral medications used by people are being used successfully to treat dogs. The most common are the antidepressants, which come in different classes. Commonly used are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Those are meds like Prozac or fluoxetine, which was tested and labeled for dogs as Reconcile. And then the others are the tricyclic antidepressants, which we have available for dogs as Clomicalm, which is clomipramine. But there are others out there. The benzodiazepines or the anxiolytics, meds like Valium or Xanax, for example, are sometimes used in conjunction with the antidepressants. And often vets will start with both because the antidepressants, some of them can take up to 6 weeks before we start to see any changes due to the medication. And so some vets will also include an anti-anxiety medication just to give the dog some immediate relief. Sometimes the anxiolytics are used situationally to treat fear and anxiety when it occurs only under very specific conditions, such as during thunderstorms or fireworks or car rides or going to the groomer or the vet, going to new places, being left alone. What we find is that if a dog can have a series of good experiences under any of these conditions, we may find that down the road, we no longer need those drugs in order to help the dog cope with those events. But some dogs do need to be on meds for their life, for their entire life. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that either. Now, the best success we see when we use meds is that they are combined with a program that also includes systematic desensitization, counter-conditioning, and training using positive reinforcement. And remember, always consult with a vet when using these medications. Don't change dosages, don't add medications, be careful adding supplements or herbs without doing so with the supervision of a vet. It can actually be quite dangerous. And As a reminder again, be patient. It's not easy. The work that we're doing with these dogs can be incredibly draining and frustrating and demoralizing sometimes, but you will discover what the word patience really means when you start to work with dogs like this. And never doubt the power of positive reinforcement. And if you don't believe me, put your favorite dessert in the freezer and you watch your freezer opening behavior increase. Food is a primary reinforcer. And it is so powerful and so potent as a reinforcer that you may even find that your freezer opening behavior persists even after you've finished your favorite Ben & Jerry's flavor of ice cream. And again, I want to thank you for your interest in working with and understanding and helping this really vulnerable and at-risk population of dogs. We need to remember just how at risk these dogs are because of their fear and any kind of potential to behave aggressively. They are often mistreated, both unintentionally and intentionally. So thank you very much for your interest in pursuing information about working with them humanely. If you want more information, I do have a couple of books that are available to help you think about and understand fear-based behaviors a little bit more. If you're struggling, I also offer phone and Skype consults. I work with pet owners and rescue groups, dog trainers who might be new to working with fear-based behavior challenges. If you're working with rescues or foster dogs, I also offer these webinars specifically to groups so that we can get all the folks on the front line, pet sitters, dog walkers, really up to speed, so that we can really get down to business and really help these dogs. One last thing, every year I do a trip down to Puerto Rico. I call it the Puerto Rico Dog Trainers Collaborative. It's not only for dog trainers, it's for anybody who's interested in dogs. We travel to Puerto Rico. This year it's December 3rd through the 9th, 2018. And we work with rescue groups and shelters and pet dog owners to help spread the word about working with all dogs, not just fearful dogs, but just to help everybody get on board so that these wonderful animals can be treated more humanely and have the best lives possible. So thanks again for joining me. If you'd like to join me in the Fearful Dog group, which is on Facebook, let me know. Having watched this video is your entry ticket into the group. That's Fearful Dogs on Facebook.